The sound of a hand striking skin cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Officer Carter's palm connected with Maya Johnson's face so hard her head snapped to the side. Blood welled at the corner of her lip, glistening under the fluorescent lights. The gallery gasped, but then silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Not a single person moved. Not the bailiff. Not the clerks. Not even Judge Wallace, who barely lifted his eyes from his papers before returning to his notes as if nothing had happened. Carter loomed over her, chest puffed with arrogance. His partner smirked, leaning on his belt, whispering a phrase meant for everyone in the room to hear. "Women like you need to learn your place." The words burned hotter than the slap. Maya did not shout back. She did not beg. She stared at his badge, memorizing the number, the name, every detail etched into the surface. Her law degree sat in her purse, a symbol of years of struggle and sacrifice. Yet in this moment it felt like a useless piece of paper. She tasted iron. She tasted fury. But above all, she tasted purpose. The courtroom returned to its sluggish rhythm, people pretending they hadn't witnessed violence in plain sight. The clerk typed. The security guard studied the floor. Every face turned away, complicit in silence. Carter jabbed his finger against her shoulder, his voice low but sharp. This isn't over. He had no idea how right he was. Earlier that morning, Maya had arrived at Brookdale County Courthouse dressed in jeans and a simple blouse. To anyone watching, she looked like an ordinary woman running an errand. But Maya Johnson was far from ordinary. She was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, and more importantly, she was the governor's nominee for a newly vacated judgeship. She had not come to make headlines. She was there for something mundane, a minor traffic citation. Handle it quickly, she thought, then head back to her office for her afternoon meetings. The lobby buzzed with its usual chaos. White defendants laughed with clerks as they navigated forms, while people of color stood quietly, waiting longer, treated colder. At the desk, Clerk Roberts barely looked up when Maya slid her paperwork forward. Violation 18C, she said clearly. He shoved a form toward her without lifting his head. Fill it out. Instructions are right there. When Maya asked him to clarify a section, he sighed dramatically, waving his hand. It's not complicated. Just read. Seconds later, a white man stepped up to the next window. Roberts practically leapt to his feet, smiling, guiding him through every line with patience. Right here for insurance, sir. Contact info there. Take your time. Maya watched the display, familiar with this brand of quiet dismissal. She had lived it her entire life. From across the lobby, Officer Carter leaned against the wall, nudging his partner, Officer Briggs. Both stared at her, snickering under their breath. It wasn't just laughter. It was recognition, the kind reserved for those they believed beneath them. The pattern was everywhere she looked. Inside the courtroom, Judge Wallace presided with an air of indifference. College students received warnings for reckless driving. A Latino man was hit with maximum fines for the same infraction. A wealthy businessman's case was dismissed after nothing more than a hushed conversation with the judge. Maya studied every detail, her attorney's instincts cataloging injustice as if gathering evidence for trial. Then her name was called. She walked to the front, file in hand. Your Honor, this ticket claims I was driving 15 miles per hour over the limit at 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. I have records proving I was on a work call at that exact time. Before she could finish, Carter stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. I remember pulling her over. She was argumentative and disrespectful, just like she's being now. Judge Wallace didn't bother hiding his disinterest. He flipped through her documents, then cut her off. Officer's testimony is clear. Pay the fine or return with formal counsel. Maya's grip tightened on her folder. She turned back toward her seat, meeting Carter's smirk. The courtroom thought they were watching a routine citation, but they had no idea what storm was about to unfold. When recess came, Maya followed Carter into the hallway. Her voice was calm, her hand steady as she tapped record on her phone, slipping it into her pocket. Officer Carter, I'd like to discuss your testimony. He turned, using his height like a weapon. Lady, I write dozens of tickets a week. You're nothing special. The citation says you stopped me Tuesday at 2. At that moment, I was on a recorded video call with my office. Maybe you were too busy running your mouth to notice. His tone sharpened. That's another violation right there. Briggs stepped closer, his smirk familiar. Problem, Carter? Just another one who thinks the rules don't apply. Maya's voice didn't waver. The report contains errors. That's a fact, Carter laughed. Your word against a decorated officer's. Guess whose version the judge believes? She turned to a passing security guard. Officer Green, would you witness this conversation? He froze, glanced at Carter, then shook his head. Not my business. Handle it in court. As he walked away, Carter sneered. See, nobody cares about your complaints. Pay your fine and learn respect. Maya stood in the corridor, her phone still recording, her cheek still stinging. She was just another black woman being dismissed by men with badges. But Carter had just given her the weapon she needed. His own arrogance. Captured in his own words. What he believed was victory was, in truth, the beginning of his end. Maya walked back into the courtroom, the echo of Carter's sneer still lingering in her mind. She sat in the gallery, every nerve on edge, yet her expression unreadable. Across the room, Carter and Briggs leaned close to Judge Wallace, whispering like conspirators. Their glances flicked toward her more than once. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. When the recess ended, Wallace's tone had shifted. Ms. Johnson, it has come to my attention that you confronted Officer Carter during the break with accusations against his professional conduct. Every eye in the courtroom snapped toward her. Your Honor, Maya began calmly. I asked him to clarify a discrepancy in his testimony. The gavel struck like a hammer. Silence. Contemptuous behavior will not be tolerated. Carter stood tall, his face carefully arranged in false respect. She accused me of falsifying my report, Your Honor. Claimed I lied under oath. Wallace leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Ms. Johnson, do you have any evidence of such misconduct? Maya reached for her phone. Yes, I recorded our conversation. The judge's face hardened. Phones are prohibited in this courthouse for recording purposes. Bailiff, confiscate the device immediately. The bailiff stepped forward, hand outstretched. Maya held the phone close. This is illegal seizure, she warned. Now, Ms. Johnson, Wallace snapped, ignoring her protest. You will apologize to Officer Carter at once. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Some stared, others looked away. Maya lifted her chin. With respect, Your Honor, I cannot apologize for seeking the truth. Wallace's complexion reddened. You will apologize or face contempt charges. The Constitution protects my right. That's it, Wallace roared, slamming his gavel again. One night in holding. Perhaps that will teach you respect. The words were barely out before Carter seized her arm, his grip unnecessarily harsh. She's resisting, he shouted, though Maya had done nothing of the sort. Then his hand struck her again, the sound cracking through the room like the opening of a nightmare. Gasps echoed, but no one moved to intervene. The clerk kept typing. The court reporter didn't even look up. Add resisting arrest to her charges, Wallace ordered coolly. Take her to holding. Blood traced the corner of Maya's mouth as Carter dragged her toward the exit. She walked with dignity, her eyes sweeping the room, memorizing every face that turned away, every clerk, every attorney, every bystander complicit in silence. They thought they had humiliated her. They thought they had won. In the holding cell, the air smelled of bleach and metal. The bench was cold beneath her. She pressed a hand to her cheek where the bruise had begun to bloom. Pain radiated outward, but inside her mind was sharper than ever. Each violation, each abuse of procedure, each moment of cowardice was being catalogued like evidence in a trial. Footsteps approached. Officer Lewis, a woman with tired eyes, stood at the bars. She paused when she saw Maya's injury. That looks bad. Do you need a medic? What I need, Maya said evenly, is my phone call. Lewis hesitated, keys jingling at her belt. She studied Maya's calm, unshaken composure. After a long moment, she nodded. Follow me. At the phone, Maya dialed from memory. The line clicked. Diane, it's me. Contact Governor Carter immediately. Tell him I've just lived through exactly what we discussed about Brookdale Court. Call Anthony at the State Review Board and have him pull Wallace's records, along with Officers Carter and Briggs. Then call Sophia at the Herald. I'll have a story for her by tomorrow. Diane's voice trembled with concern. Are you all right? Not yet, Maya whispered, glancing at Officer Lewis, who was watching her closely. But I will be, her voice firmed. One more thing. Call my brother Daniel. Tell him to bring the sealed envelope from my safe straight to the governor's office. As she hung up, she turned to Lewis. I want to file an assault report against Officer Carter, And I need your badge number as witness to my current condition. Lewis shifted uneasily. You should know Carter and Judge Wallace are close. Complaints disappear around here. I'm still filing it, Maya replied without a hint of hesitation. Justice isn't about making friends. Back in her cell, she lay on the hard bench, eyes closed but mind racing. She had spent her career studying patterns of corruption, gathering evidence, building networks. What they thought was a casual show of power was, in fact, the spark that would ignite a fire. They saw a woman they believed could be silenced. They did not see Maya Johnson, the governor's nominee, the attorney who had prepared her entire life for this exact fight. An hour later, Lewis returned, her expression nervous. Someone from the governor's office just called. You're being released. Maya rose slowly, the bruise still dark on her skin. She was not surprised. The wheels of consequence had already begun to turn. The power dynamic had shifted, and they didn't even know it yet. Judge Wallace entered his chambers the next morning to find an envelope waiting on his desk. The seal of the State Judicial Review Board stared back at him. His hands trembled as he broke it open. Inside was a notice. An emergency hearing had been scheduled to review his conduct in court the previous day. It specifically mentioned his handling of Maya Johnson. His phone rang almost instantly. On the other end was Officer Carter, his voice dripping with frustration. Judge, this is just noise. Some woman making trouble. We've handled worse, Wallace cut him off. That woman is not just anyone. Her complaint is signed as Maya Johnson, state judicial nominee. She's the governor's pick. The line went silent. Across town, Maya sat in the governor's office. The bruise on her cheek was faintly concealed with makeup, but still visible. Governor Carter paced the room, shaking his head. This is exactly why I put your name forward. The system needed someone who had lived its failures, not just studied them. Maya's voice was steady. I don't want personal vengeance. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have my connections. I want accountability that outlives this moment. She slid a folder across his desk. Inside were 5 recent cases from Brookdale Court, each one showing the same pattern of bias and misconduct. This is just the last month. Imagine the past decade. The governor's expression darkened as he flipped through the files. How did you compile all this so quickly? I've been watching them for years, she replied. Yesterday made it personal. Meanwhile, at the Brookdale Police Precinct, Carter and Briggs were summoned to Captain Lawson's office. He was livid. What exactly happened in that courtroom yesterday? Carter leaned back with forced nonchalance. Standard contempt case. She was disrespectful. Lawson slid a photograph across the desk. Maya's face stared back at them, swollen and bruised, professionally documented for evidence. Then he pressed a button on his computer. The sound of their hallway exchange filled the room, every sneer, every mocking word captured by Maya's phone. Briggs paled. Captain, we didn't know who she was. That's the problem, Lawson snapped. You shouldn't treat anyone that way, nominee or not. What they thought was buried had already risen to the surface. By morning, the city paper carried the headline in bold print. Judicial nominee assaulted in court. Systemic bias exposed. Maya's photograph covered the front page. Online, the story exploded. Within hours, our Justice for Maya trended across the country. People poured out their own stories of mistreatment in Brookdale Court, voices long ignored now given a platform. The review board moved fast. Court records were subpoenaed. Staff testimonies were demanded. Every official who had turned away the previous day now found themselves summoned under oath. Officer Lewis, the woman who had watched Maya make her call from the holding area, sat stiffly before investigators. I saw her injury. I heard Carter and Briggs laughing about teaching her a lesson afterward. The room grew quiet. Were you aware of previous incidents? The investigator asked. Lewis hesitated, then squared her shoulders. Yes, many. It was expected behavior. At noon, the police commissioner faced cameras at an emergency press conference. His forehead glistened under the lights. We take these allegations extremely seriously. The officers involved have been placed on leave pending investigation. But for Maya, this was only the beginning. That same afternoon, she presented her evidence to the State Bar's Ethics Committee. The table overflowed with documents, transcripts, sentencing records, charts highlighting statistical disparities that could no longer be ignored. This is not about one judge or 2 officers, she said firmly, the purple bruise still marking her face. This is about a culture that allows abuse of power to thrive, and it must end. Justice Rivera, chair of the committee, flipped through the stack of files with growing alarm. Ms. Johnson, this is extensive. How long have you been collecting this? 3 years, she answered without hesitation. Since I first noticed the sentencing patterns while defending clients in this very courthouse. In his home, Wallace paced before his television as coverage of his suspension played on the screen. His phone rang. It was the chief judge of the district. Walter, this is bad, the voice warned. The governor is calling for a complete audit of your rulings for the past 5 years. Wallace's face flushed with anger. Over one incident? This is ridiculous. It's not one incident, the voice cut him off. They have data, and patterns that are impossible to defend. In a dimly lit bar across town, Carter nursed a drink with Briggs. This will blow over, he muttered. It always does, but Briggs shook his head slowly. They're saying the governor nominated her specifically to clean out corruption in the courts. She's not just some defendant anymore. She's about to become our boss's boss. Neither man knew that the investigation was already reaching deeper than they could imagine, and Maya had only just begun to reveal the extent of her plan. The review board worked through the weekend, refusing to let momentum die. Files piled high, subpoenas flew out like storm winds, and one by one the pieces of a rotten system began to fall into place. Court transcripts, sentencing data, and eyewitness statements painted a damning picture. Brookdale Court had operated for years under patterns of discrimination so blatant they could no longer be disguised as coincidence. At the same time, Maya's story reached national morning television. She sat in front of the cameras with quiet strength, the fading bruise on her cheek impossible to ignore. This isn't about my experience, she explained to millions watching. It's about a system that treats people differently depending on race, income, and status. The clip went viral before noon. Legal experts filled the airwaves, agreeing the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. What's happening in Brookdale is not isolated, one professor said. It mirrors failures in jurisdictions across the country. Behind closed doors, the police union met with Carter and Briggs. Their representative shoved settlement papers across the table. She's refusing every offer. She doesn't want money. She wants accountability. You two have made yourselves the example. Carter's face burned red. We were blindsided. We didn't even know who she was. The rep leaned forward coldly. You slapped a judicial nominee in open court. That's not being blindsided. That's being reckless. Meanwhile, Wallace received news from his attorney that chilled him to the bone. The investigation has expanded, the lawyer said grimly. They're looking at financial irregularities. Reduced sentences for certain associates, dismissed tickets for well-connected friends. Once they started digging, they found much more than what happened yesterday. Wallace's arrogance finally cracked. He slumped into his chair, muttering, "This is bigger than me." "Yes," the lawyer replied. "And you're going down with it." In the governor's office, Maya stood before a whiteboard covered in charts and timelines. The newly formed Judicial Reform Task Force listened closely as she outlined a vision far greater than punishing a handful of corrupt officials. We need structural change, she told them. Mandatory bias training, independent review of sentencing, civilian oversight committees, transparent disciplinary procedures. This isn't just about individuals. It's about rewriting the foundation. Governor Carter studied the proposals. This plan could reshape the entire state justice system. That's the goal, Maya answered firmly. Justice shouldn't depend on who you are or who you know. The press conference came days later, drawing reporters from every major network. Cameras filled the room until the air buzzed with static. The governor stepped forward first, his expression solemn. Today, I'm not only announcing Maya Johnson's confirmation to the Superior Court, but also her appointment as the first commissioner of our new Judicial Accountability Commission. The crowd erupted in shouts and flashes. And then came the revelation no one expected. What the public doesn't know, the governor continued, is that Ms. Johnson's experience in Brookdale Court was part of an undercover investigation into systematic abuse of power. Gasps swept through the room. Phones lit up with alerts. Anchors scrambled to rewrite their scripts. Maya stepped to the podium, her bearing regal despite the bruise that still marked her cheek. 3 months ago, we received dozens of complaints about Brookdale Court. I could have opened a standard investigation. Instead, I chose to experience the system as an ordinary citizen. Behind her, screens displayed sentencing disparities, hidden camera footage of backroom deals, and sworn testimonies from defendants. The evidence was overwhelming. The assault I endured was not planned, Maya said, touching her cheek lightly, but it revealed the true culture of that courthouse better than any file ever could. Across town, Carter sat in his living room watching the broadcast, his jaw dropping. "She set us up," he roared, slamming his fist onto the table. Briggs shook his head, pale and defeated. "No, we set ourselves up. She just gave us the chance to prove it." At the courthouse, staff gathered around television screens in silence. Clerk Roberts, who had once brushed Maya aside, felt his stomach twist as her evidence rolled across the screen. Reporters peppered Maya with questions. "Did you plan to be assaulted that day?" one asked. "Of course not," she answered firmly. "I planned to observe and document." The assault revealed how normalized misconduct had become, another reporter pressed. "Some are calling this entrapment." "I entered that courtroom with a genuine traffic citation," she replied. "I didn't provoke anything. I simply experienced what countless citizens endure daily. The difference is, I had the power to act." By the time the press conference ended, the justice system in Brookdale had already shifted under the weight of public outrage. Judges, clerks, and officers who once moved unchecked now found their every decision under scrutiny, and Maya was just getting started. 3 months later, the very same courtroom that had once been a stage for humiliation was transformed into a place of reckoning. The gallery was packed, not with silent onlookers, but with journalists, civil rights observers, and citizens who wanted to witness history. Security was tight, cameras rolled, and the atmosphere felt electric, as though everyone knew something monumental was about to unfold. Maya Johnson now sat on the bench in her judge's robe. Her voice was calm, her presence unshakable. "The disciplinary hearing of former Officer James Carter will now begin." Carter entered in handcuffs, his once cocky posture gone. His attorney shuffled beside him, grim-faced. The list of charges seemed endless: assault, false testimony, excessive force, civil rights violations. It took nearly 2 minutes for the clerk to read them all. Each charge felt like a weight pressing down on the man who once believed himself untouchable. The evidence rolled out like a tidal wave. Body cam footage showing Carter mocking defendants, court records revealing a suspicious pattern of arrests almost exclusively targeting minorities, testimonies from colleagues who finally broke silence about his intimidation and falsified reports. The gallery shifted uneasily as every layer of corruption peeled away. When Carter finally spoke, his voice had none of the bravado it once carried. "I never thought about the impact of my actions," he muttered, barely audible. "The badge meant I was always right." Maya's gaze stayed firm. "Officer Carter, were you trained on proper courtroom conduct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And were you aware that using physical force against a non-threatening civilian violates policy?" "Yes." "Then did you consider the consequences of striking me that day in this courtroom?" A long silence filled the air. Finally, he whispered, "No, I didn't think there would be any." Every spectator felt the weight of that admission. It wasn't just Carter speaking. It was the voice of a culture that had thrived on the belief of immunity. Next came Briggs. Unlike Carter, he had accepted a plea deal in exchange for cooperation. His testimony was damning. It wasn't just us. It was expected. Certain judges wanted certain people handled a certain way. We knew Wallace would look the other way. The room rippled with shock. Then came Wallace himself. The once imposing judge shuffled to the stand, pale and diminished. His words attempted to mask years of bias behind bureaucratic language. "We called it community management," he explained, trying to defend discriminatory practices as if they were policy. "So you intentionally applied different standards of justice based on race and income?" Maya's voice cut clean through the air. Wallace squirmed. "Not officially, but it was understood." The murmur of disgust in the gallery grew louder. This was no longer just about a slap in a courtroom. It was about the exposure of a culture rotten to its core. When the testimonies ended, Maya leaned forward. Her words carried the weight of generations denied justice. "The foundation of our legal system is equal treatment under the law. When those entrusted to uphold it perverted instead, they unravel the very fabric of society." She turned her eyes to Carter. "Your actions were not isolated lapses. They formed a pattern of abuse fueled by arrogance and shielded by silence. Your punishment will reflect not only accountability for your crimes, but also deterrence for those who believe they are above the law. The sentence came swift. 5 years in prison without parole, permanent loss of his law enforcement credentials, and mandatory community service in the very neighborhoods he once terrorized. For Wallace, the judgment was even heavier: disbarment. 15 years in prison for corruption and civil rights violations. Full restitution to victims of his sentencing bias. The gallery erupted with tears, gasps, even applause stifled quickly by security. Yet the atmosphere was not one of celebration, it was one of release. For the first time in decades, accountability had broken through. As Carter was led away in chains, he finally met Maya's gaze. No words passed between them, but in his eyes lingered a truth he could no longer deny. The system that once empowered him had been rewritten. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed with people carrying signs not of anger this time, but of hope. Equal justice under law. Thank you, Judge Johnson. The chants were not cries of protest, but songs of change. Maya addressed the press briefly, her robe still draped across her shoulders. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning. Justice is not a moment. It is a practice, and this practice will not end here. What began as humiliation had transformed into revolution, but Maya knew her work was far from finished. The system itself still needed rebuilding from the ground up, and she was determined to see it through. 1 year later, the courthouse where Maya had been slapped was unrecognizable. The marble floors gleamed under new skylights, but it wasn't just the building that had changed. Transparency screens lined the lobby walls, displaying live data on sentencing outcomes broken down by race and income. Every visitor could see in real time whether justice was truly blind. The name had changed too. No longer Brookdale Court, it was now called the Unity Justice Center, a symbol of what it had become. Community volunteers stood at information desks guiding defendants, not intimidating them. The fear that once hung in the air had been replaced by cautious hope. Governor Carter convened a summit in a packed auditorium where delegations from 12 states gathered to study what reporters now called the Johnson model. The governor spoke with pride. What Judge Johnson created here is more than reform. It's a blueprint for national transformation. Maya stepped forward to present the data herself. Charts glowed behind her, showing sentencing disparities cut nearly in half, citizen complaints resolved within days, and public trust in the courts rising faster than anyone predicted. Reform is not a one-time act, she said firmly. It's a continuous process. Bias runs deep, but vigilance runs deeper. Across the state, retired judges, civil rights attorneys, and law students rallied to support her commission. Officer Lewis, now promoted to captain, led the new court conduct unit. Her team monitored officer behavior, investigated misconduct, and retrained officers on accountability. Some resisted, calling her a traitor. Others, especially younger recruits, saw her as proof that integrity was not a liability but a calling. Even Briggs, who had taken a plea deal, spent his community service speaking to cadets at the police academy. I thought power came from the badge, he told them with his voice heavy. But real power comes from trust. Lose that and you lose everything. Inside the Unity Center, Clerk Roberts' replacement, a young man named Diaz, unveiled a new case management system. Judges were assigned cases randomly, and algorithms flagged disparities automatically for independent review. The old system ran on favors and connections, Diaz explained to visiting officials. This one runs on fairness. Law journals published papers on Maya's methods. Civil rights organizations praised her for shining a light on what had been normalized for decades. National networks carried stories not just of her courtroom, but of families reunited after wrongful convictions were overturned. Yet Maya never claimed victory. At every briefing, she reminded her team, "This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else suffers what I did. Justice cannot depend on who you are or where you come from." 5 years later, the morning light streamed through her chambers as Maya packed the last of her belongings into a box. On her wall hung framed charts showing the transformation of the system, statistics, photographs of families restored, and the first official complaint she had filed against Carter. The governor had nominated her to the state Supreme Court, a higher seat from which to safeguard the reforms she had built. Her successor, Judge Omar Washington, entered quietly. He had once been a public defender in the same neighborhoods Maya had grown up in. He looked around her office with reverence. "I still remember watching the news when you were assaulted in this courthouse," he said softly. "That day changed everything for me. It showed me that change was possible." Together they walked the halls she had reshaped. The building hummed with new energy, alive with diversity, fairness, and open information. At the security desk, a young officer greeted her warmly. "Last day, Judge Johnson? We'll miss you here." "The work continues," she replied with a gentle smile, "just from a different bench." Outside the courthouse, a man stood across the street watching. Carter, older now, carrying the lines of prison on his face. Their eyes met. He gave the smallest nod, then turned and walked away. Maya whispered to herself, "A reminder of why we do this." That afternoon, the courthouse that once witnessed her humiliation now honored her legacy with a farewell ceremony. Leaders from across the state praised her impact. The governor himself placed the state justice medal around her neck. Judge Johnson did not just change policies, she changed what justice means in practice. When Maya spoke, her words carried the weight of years of struggle. 5 years ago, I lived what countless citizens had endured for decades. The only difference was that I had the power to fight back. Justice is not punishment. Justice is transformation. It is making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. Judge Washington presented her with a gavel engraved with her guiding principle. Justice sees no status, only humanity. As she left the courthouse for the final time as its judge, a young law student stopped her on the steps. "Any advice for someone who wants to follow your path?" Maya smiled. "Remember, power is not meant to lift you above others. It's meant to lift others with you." The crowd erupted in applause as she walked down the steps into the sunlight, her legacy etched not in marble or metals, but in the lives of every person who would now walk into that courthouse and finally find fairness waiting on the other side.